The rain had been falling for 6 hours when Colt Drennan pulled his truck to the shoulder of Route 9 and cut the engine. He did not get out right away. He sat with both hands on the wheel and watched the downpour sheet across the windshield in thick, blinding curtains, the kind of rain that erases everything beyond 20 feet and makes the world feel like it has shrunk to just this cab, just this moment, just this dog breathing steadily in the back seat. Boone had his chin on the armrest, watching the road the way he always watched roads, with that calm, working attention that reminded Colt of good sentries and old sergeants. The German shepherd had been awake for the past hour of driving without complaint, just watching. Outside, the flooded ditch along the shoulder ran fast and brown. A mailbox leaned at the edge of the road. The number on it read 4417. Beyond it, through the rain, Colt could just make out the pale shape of a farmhouse. The porch light was on. He was not sure why that mattered to him. He had driven past 100 porch lights in the last 3 months, moving from one town to the next across the eastern part of the state, picking up day labor when it was available, sleeping in the truck when it was not. He was 39 years old, and he had served 4 tours, and he was not sure what he was looking for when he drove. He was not sure he was looking for anything. He just found it easier to keep moving than to stop. That porch light. And then he saw her. She was standing on the edge of the porch in the rain, not sheltered under the overhang, but standing in it, getting soaked, looking out at the road. She was old, maybe 75, small-framed and white-haired, and she was holding something bundled against her chest. She was not waving. She was not calling out. She was just standing there in the downpour as if she had been waiting for a specific truck on a specific night and had made peace with waiting as long as it took. Colt put the truck in park and looked at Boone. Boone was already looking at him. If this story stays with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more coming, and you will not want to miss it. Colt got out of the truck. He had left the Marine Corps 14 months ago after 16 years, a medical separation, 2 Purple Hearts, and a left knee that a VA orthopedist had described, not unkindly, as a piece of work. He had not received the discharge poorly. He had not wept or raged or told anyone it was unfair, because it was not unfair. 16 years was a long time, and some of those years had been very hard, and the Corps had been good to him in its stern and demanding way, and when the time came, he had signed his paperwork and driven away without looking back at the base in his rearview mirror, because he had learned over many years in many countries that looking back was a thing that cost more than it gave. He had gone home to his mother's house in Dunbar, a small town in the hill country that sits between 2 ridge lines and gets serious weather from September through April. He had stayed for 3 weeks and left when the walls started pressing in. He had not told his mother why he was leaving. He had told her he had some things to sort out and that he would call. He had called twice. Boone had come from a handler whose name was Perkins, a staff sergeant who had suffered a stroke at 42 and could no longer work dogs. Perkins had called Colt from the hospital and asked if he would take Boone, and Colt had driven 6 hours in February to pick him up. Boone was 8 years old, tan and black, a big, muscular, working-line shepherd with a scarred left ear and the kind of steady temperament that could not be trained into a dog. It had to be there from the beginning. In Boone, it had always been there. They had been together for 11 months. In that time, Colt had come to trust the dog's read on things more than he trusted almost any other signal he had access to. He crossed the wet gravel in 3 strides, Boone at his left heel, and stepped under the edge of the farmhouse porch. The woman was standing there soaking wet, and now he could see what she was holding. It was a wool blanket, old and faded green, folded carefully despite the rain, held against her chest with both arms. She was wearing a canvas jacket over a cotton nightgown. Her white hair had gone flat against her face. She was looking at him with the particular expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. "I saw your lights," she said. "Road wash is out, a quarter-mile up. Somebody ought to tell you before you drive into it." Colt stood still for a moment, rain dripping off the brim of his cap. "I appreciate that." She looked at Boone. Boone sat without being told and looked back at her with his ears slightly forward, calm and steady. The woman's expression shifted just barely, the way a room shifts when someone turns on a lamp in the corner. "That is a working dog," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "You are soaked through?" "I am." She held out the blanket. Colt looked at it. It was the only dry thing visible on that porch. Everything else, the old chair, the wooden boxes, the braided rug against the door, had been touched by the blown rain and was dark with moisture. This blanket had been held inside her jacket until the moment she decided to give it away. When she shifted it toward him, something moved beneath it. A small pin catching the porch light. He looked closer. It was a purple heart, mounted on a piece of dark velvet pinned just inside the fold of the blanket, and she was handing it to him without saying a word about it. Colt did not take the blanket right away. He stood there in the rain for a long moment, long enough that Boone looked up at him once and then back at the woman. "This yours?" he asked. She did not answer for a moment. Then she said, "It was my husband's. He passed." Her name was Delia Marsh. She told him that much standing on the porch, and then she told him to come inside before he gave himself pneumonia, and he went, because Boone had already stood up and moved toward the door, which Colt had learned to read as a signal of a particular kind. The farmhouse was a two-story clapboard structure, built in the early 1950s by Delia's husband's father, a man named Elton Marsh, who had come back from Korea with one eye, a land grant, and what Delia described as a permanent need to have something to build. The inside smelled of old wood and dried herbs and the particular warmth of a house that has been heated by the same stove for decades. There were photographs on every wall, black and white and color mixed together without particular order, children and fields and a man in uniform at various ages. A wedding picture. A dog that looked nothing like Boone but sat the same way. Delia made coffee without asking and set 2 cups on the kitchen table. She sat across from Colt and folded her hands and looked at him the way older women in farming country look at strangers, which is to say directly and without apology. "Where are you headed?" she said. "Nowhere particular," Colt said. "How long?" 14 months. She nodded as if that were a reasonable number, which it probably was to her. "Harold drove that way for about 2 years after he came home from Vietnam," she said. "He didn't say why. I didn't ask. He came back when he ran out of road, I suppose." She said Harold's name the way people say the names of the dead when they have had long enough to make peace with the loss, which is to say without flinching, but also without rushing past it. Colt looked at the walls. When did he pass? February. A year ago, February. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. He was 79. We were married 52 years. Boone had settled near the wood stove at the far end of the kitchen. He had his head down on his paws, but his eyes were open, tracking the room in the slow way he tracked things when he was at rest, but still watching. Delia had noticed. "He is keeping track," she said. "He always is. Harold's dog used to do that." She looked at Boone for a moment. "German Shepherd, too. Came back with him from the service. We had her for 12 years. Colt drank his coffee and did not say anything. Outside, the rain had intensified. It hammered the tin sections of the porch roof and ran loud in the downspouts, and somewhere at the back of the house a shutter was loose and knocking in the wind. Colt noticed it and said nothing, but he filed it. What he had already filed, without meaning to, was a longer list. The mailbox leaning, the porch step with the soft center that had given slightly under his boot, the kitchen window with the cracked glazing compound along the lower sill, the kind of crack that lets cold air in by November and ice by January, the gutter section he had seen from the yard, hanging at an angle. Harold Marsh had been gone a year, and the house was beginning to register his absence in the way old houses do. A slow and dignified and unstoppable deterioration that moved faster than one person alone could manage. He did not say any of this. He asked about the road. "It washes every heavy rain," Delia said. "Has for years. County puts gravel down and the next rain takes it. Harold used to call and complain. I don't bother. Is there a way around?" "Township Road off Birch Mill. 3 miles longer, but it stays up." Colt noted the route. He would need it in the morning. He was going to have to ask to sleep in his truck in her driveway, since the road was impassable, and he was already thinking about how to phrase it without making her uncomfortable. He did not need to phrase it. She told him the guest room was at the top of the stairs, first door on the left, and that there were dry towels in the closet, and that she would not hear any argument about it. Boone could sleep wherever he chose. Boone chose the braided rug outside the guest room door. In the morning, Colt fixed the shutter. He had found the right screws in Harold's workshop, a meticulously organized space in the back of the barn that smelled of machine oil and cedar, and had a pegboard on the wall where every tool hung on an outlined hook, so you could see at a glance what was missing. Harold Marsh had been that kind of man. Colt could see it in the workshop the way you could sometimes see a person in a room they built and kept. The tools were old but cared for. The workbench was spotless. There was a coffee can with pencils sharpened to an exact length, and a notepad with measurements written in a careful, deliberate hand. Colt fixed the shutter, and then fixed the porch step, and then sat in the yard afterward eating the eggs Delia had made, and watching the fields drain in the gray morning light. She came out with more coffee and sat in the other chair and did not tell him he should get moving. "You were in the Corps," she said. Not a question. She had seen his tattoo, or she had seen the way he moved, or both. "Yes, ma'am. Gunnery sergeant." "Harold was Army. 67th Infantry. Vietnam? 68 through 70? She looked at the fields. "He never talked about it much. I learned not to ask the wrong questions." "What were the right ones?" "The ones about the people he served with. The men he knew. You could get Harold talking for an hour if you asked him about the right person." Colt thought about that. It was true, in his experience. The events were hard to talk about. The people were different. He stayed through the morning. He told himself it was because the side road would still be soft, and he did not want to bottom out the truck on a farm track, which was partly true. He was reglazing the kitchen window by noon, having found the compound and the tool in Harold's workshop, and Delia was at the table sorting through a box of papers with the careful attention of someone doing something she had been putting off for months. The papers were related to the farm. Colt did not ask about them directly. He worked, and she sorted, and Boone lay in the patch of thin October sunlight that came through the back door, and the house was quiet, in the way of a place that has known a great deal of living, and is now taking a breath. It was mid-afternoon when Delia said, without particular preamble, "I may lose this farm." Colt stopped working. He set down the putty knife and turned around. She was holding a letter. It was on the letterhead of something called Groveland Property Holdings. And even from across the kitchen, Colt could see the formal typeface and the density of the text, which was the typeface and density of legal correspondence that means to sound official and hopes that will be enough. "What does it say?" he asked. Delia looked at it for a moment. "It says I owe back taxes on an assessment I never received. 3 years of it. It says the amount is $41,000, and if it is not paid within 60 days, the property qualifies for tax lien sale." She set the letter on the table. "This is the second one. I got the first one in July, and I called the county assessor's office, and they said they had no record of any outstanding balance." Colt pulled a chair out and sat down at the table. "Do you have the first letter?" "I have both." "Do you have your tax payment receipts? The ones you paid?" "Harold kept everything. It is all in that workshop." Colt spent the next 2 hours in Harold's workshop going through files. The man had kept every tax receipt for the property going back to 1987. He had kept them in labeled hanging folders in a metal filing cabinet that had been built to last and had. Each receipt was dated, stamped by the county collector's office, and noted in Harold's careful handwriting in a ledger that tracked every expense and payment the farm had ever generated. There was no outstanding balance. There never had been. The letter from Groveland Property Holdings was not from the county. It only looked like it was. Colt sat with that for a moment in the quiet of Harold's workshop, with the smell of machine oil and the October light coming through the small window and Boone sitting beside him watching his face. The letter had a return address. It had a contact name, a man named Brent Ackerley, Regional Acquisitions Director. It had a phone number and a website. It looked like a piece of official county correspondence if you did not read it closely enough to see that the county seal in the header was slightly wrong, the eagle facing the wrong direction, and that the tax identification numbers did not match the county's actual format. It was designed to frighten an elderly widow into thinking she owed money she did not owe, and it was working. Colt walked back to the house with the files under his arm, and Harold's ledger and both letters, and he sat back down at the kitchen table and laid it all out. He explained it to Delia carefully, without heat, the way he had learned to explain things in the Corps when a situation was serious and someone needed to hear it clearly. He showed her where the seal was wrong. He showed her that the county's records and Harold's records matched. He told her that Groveland Property Holdings was not the county. He told her what he thought was happening. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a while. "I wondered," she said at last. "Harold used to say if something does not feel right, it probably is not. But I did not know what I was looking at." "Most people wouldn't," Colt said. "It is designed to look real." "What do I do?" "We go to the county assessor's office in person. We get a written statement that your taxes are current. We take Harold's records. Then we take both letters and the Groveland information to the county sheriff's office and file a report." She looked at him. "We?" Colt looked at Boone, who had come to stand near the kitchen table without being called. He looked back at Delia. "I am not in a particular hurry," he said. The county seat was 14 miles east. They went the next morning, Delia in the passenger seat of the truck with Harold's files on her lap and Boone in the back, and Colt drove the township road off Birch Mill that Delia had described, which was longer but solid. The October morning was cold and clear after the rain, and the fields on either side of the road were still dark with water, but the sky had come out blue and hard, the particular blue of mid-autumn in the hill country that feels like a held breath before winter comes. The county assessor's office was on the second floor of the courthouse. The clerk was a woman in her early 40s named Patrice, and she pulled up Delia's property account while Colt stood to one side with the files and Boone waited in the truck. And she confirmed what Harold's ledger already showed. The property taxes on the Marsh farm were fully paid through the current year. There was no outstanding balance, no lien, no filing of any kind indicating delinquency. Patrice looked at the Groveland letter for a long time. "We have seen two others like this," she said quietly enough that it was clear she was choosing her words. Different properties, different names, the same letterhead. "What happened with the others?" Colt asked. Patrice looked at Delia. "One settled. Paid the amount in the letter." Delia absorbed that. "They paid $41,000 that they did not owe." "Yes?" There was a silence in the assessor's office, the kind of silence that contains a great deal of suppressed anger and nowhere to put it. "They will not be the last," Colt said. "No," Patrice said. "Probably not." She gave them a printed statement of account showing no outstanding balance. She kept a copy of both Groveland letters. She wrote down the contact number for the county's fraud reporting unit and underlined the name of the investigator who handled property matters. His name was Dennis Farrow, and he worked out of the sheriff's department on the ground floor of the same building. They went down to see him that afternoon. Dennis Farrow was 53, compact, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had been doing paperwork for a long time and had made a particular peace with it. He wore a deputy's star and reading glasses, and he had two filing folders already open on his desk when they came in, which told Colt that Patrice had called ahead. He looked at Harold's files and both letters and the printed account statement, and asked Colt 3 precise questions about where the first letter had come from and when, and then he spent several minutes looking at the Groveland letterhead under a desk lamp. "The seal is wrong," Colt said. "Yes, it is," Farrow said. "Second one I've seen with this specific error." He sat back. "Tell me about the contact." "Brent Ackerley." Colt told him what was in the letter. Farrow wrote it down. "Regional Acquisitions Director," Farrow said without expression. "For what region, I wonder?" He took copies of everything. He gave Delia his direct line and told her that if she received any further correspondence from Groveland or any phone calls from anyone identifying themselves as associated with Groveland or with the county tax office, she was to call him before responding. He said it plainly and without alarm, in the manner of a man who was being careful to keep the alarm out of his voice, so it did not take up residence in hers. On the way back to the farm, Delia held the copy of Harold's ledger on her lap and looked out the passenger window at the passing fields. "Harold kept that ledger for 30 years, she said. Colt drove. "He used to say the only thing that protected a person in this world was a record of what actually happened." She paused. "I used to think he was being fussy about it." "He was right," Colt said. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "The people who got the first letter. The ones who paid." "I know. Is there any way to get their money back?" "Farrow will try. He'll probably involve the state." Colt glanced in the mirror. Boone was watching the road. "If they can trace where the money went, there are recovery mechanisms. It is slow, but it exists." Delia turned that over. She was not naive about it. He could see that in the set of her jaw, the particular expression of a woman who had farmed through droughts and bad markets, and the death of the man who had built this life with her, and who understood that the distance between what justice required and what it delivered was often measured in years. She did not give up on it either. That was equally clear. They ate supper that evening at the kitchen table, and afterward Colt sat on the porch in the cold with Boone and a cup of coffee and watched the fields go dark under the stars. He had not intended to stay more than one night. He was still not sure what he intended. 2 days later, Farrow called. He had run the Groveland Property Holdings registration through state business records and found that it was a shell entity registered in a state 600 miles away with a registered agent who was an attorney with a disciplinary history and 3 addresses that did not correspond to any real office. Ackerley, the name on the letters, was a name attached to 2 other fraudulent correspondence schemes in 2 other counties in 2 other states, and there was now a federal mail fraud referral pending. The family that had paid $41,000 was being contacted by a restitution unit. He told Colt this on the phone, and then he said, "Your involvement in getting Mrs. Marsh to come in when she did was significant. The documentation she brought was exactly what we needed to confirm the pattern." Colt said he had not done much. He had just helped read some paperwork. Farrow said, "A lot of these cases die because nobody helps the recipient read the paperwork. They are designed not to be readable. The fear is the mechanism." After he hung up, Colt sat in Harold's workshop for a while. Boone was on the floor beside the filing cabinet. The October afternoon light came through the small window at a low angle and lit the pegboard and the tools hanging on their outlined hooks. He had been in the Corps for 16 years. He had done a great many things in 16 years, and some of them were things he could look at straight, and some of them were things he looked at sideways from an angle because the direct view was still too much. He did not think about that often. He thought about it now briefly in the quiet of Harold Marsh's workshop. And then he thought about an old man who had come home from Vietnam in 1970 and spent the next 50 years building something careful and precise and worth protecting, and had protected it by keeping a record of what actually happened. He picked up one of the pencils from the coffee can. It was sharpened to an exact length. He put it back. He went inside and told Delia what Farrow had said. She listened, and then she went to the window and looked out at the fields for a long moment, and when she turned back around, her eyes were bright. "Harold would have been livid," she said. "Yes, ma'am." And then he would have gone straight to the workshop and built something. The corners of her mouth moved. That was his way. When he did not know what else to do, he built something. She looked at Colt. Then she looked past him at the hallway, as if she were looking at something he couldn't see. "There is a fence line on the south field that has needed work for 2 seasons, she said. "Harold never got to it. His knee was bothering him, and then by spring he was not well enough." Colt said nothing. "I cannot pay much," Delia said. "But the workshop has everything you would need, and there is a room." Colt looked at Boone. Boone was lying near the wood stove, and at the moment Colt looked at him, he lifted his head and looked back, and then he put his chin back on his paws and let out a slow breath, the particular breath of a dog that has found a place it intends to remain. Colt thought about 3 months of moving. He thought about the particular quality of this kitchen and this house and this woman who had stood in the rain holding the only dry thing she had and offered it to a stranger. He thought about the Purple Heart pinned beneath that blanket. Harold Marsh had earned it, and he had come home, and he had built a fence line and kept a ledger and stayed 52 years. And now the fence line needed work, and the ledger had done its job, and the place was still standing. "I will start on the fence tomorrow," Colt said, "if the ground is not too soft." Delia nodded once, in the manner of someone confirming a thing that had been decided before it was spoken. The fence work took 10 days. The south field had a 1/4 mile of line that needed restringing and a dozen posts that had heaved in the frost and needed resetting. And Colt worked it methodically, 1 section at a time, with the cold coming down harder each day as October moved toward its end. Boone ran the fence line in the mornings while Colt worked, checking the perimeter the way he had always checked perimeters, and then settling near whichever post Colt was working on, watching the fields. A neighbor came by on the fourth day. She drove a faded blue pickup, and her name was June Hartwell. And she was in her late 60s, wide-shouldered and practical, with the look of a woman who had been farming adjacent land for decades and felt no need to introduce herself formally. She got out of the truck and looked at the fence work and looked at Colt and said, "You do good work." Colt said, "Thank you." She said, "I have been meaning to check on Delia. How is she?" He told her about the letters briefly, without detail. June's face went through several things in quick succession and settled on a controlled anger that was clearly not new, just newly informed. "I heard about something like this in Hanover County," she said. "Old man Pruitt. Lost $40,000, and by the time he understood what had happened, the money was gone." She looked at the fence line. "Did they find the people responsible?" "There is a federal referral now," Colt said, "and the family that paid is being worked through a restitution process." June stood with her hands in her jacket pockets. "Good," she said, and it carried a weight that was partly about the Pruitts and partly about something older and harder that she did not elaborate on. She came back 2 days later with her husband, who was in his early 70s, and moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned not to waste motion after decades of physical work, and they brought a casserole and a roll of additional fence wire that was better quality than what Colt had been using, and they stayed for 2 hours. June's husband, whose name was Frank, spent most of that time with Colt at the fence line, not talking much, but working alongside him, with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work all his life. On the last day of the fence work, a man from the township came by. He introduced himself as Vic Stroud, a township trustee, and he had with him a printed document that he presented to Delia at the kitchen table, while Colt stood in the doorway still in his work clothes. The document was a formal assessment notification from the county, real this time, with the proper seal in the proper format, and Delia's correct account number, showing her property tax account as current and flagged for monitoring following the fraud report. Vic Stroud was 61, heavyset, with a gray mustache and the kind of expression that combined official seriousness with genuine personal discomfort. The face of a man who was embarrassed that this had happened in his township. "We should have caught the pattern sooner," he said. "You are catching it now," Delia said. "We have identified 2 other properties in the township that received similar letters. One of those families paid." He paused. "We are working to make sure that does not happen elsewhere." After he left, Delia put the document in Harold's filing cabinet. She put it in a new folder that she labeled in her own handwriting. Current and clear. She placed it at the front of the cabinet. Colt watched her do this and felt something in his chest that he could not name precisely. It was adjacent to relief, but not exactly relief. It was the feeling of a thing settled, which was different from a thing fixed, but was its own specific and worthwhile condition. November came in cold, with the first hard frosts and the particular quality of light that arrives in the hill country when the leaves are down and the fields are bare and the ridge lines show their full shape against a sky gone pale and final. Delia moved through the house in her practiced way, the way of a woman who had lived in the same rooms for decades and knew them in the dark as well as in the light. And Colt moved through the yard and the barn and the workshop in a way that was becoming, without his precisely intending it, his own particular way. He had called his mother in October, standing in the driveway with his phone and Boone at his feet. He had told her he had stopped moving. She had been quiet on the line for a moment, and then she had said, "Where?" And he had told her, and she had said, "Good," and that had been most of it. He had not told her about Delia or the farm or the letters or Harold Marsh's ledger. He had not told her about the Purple Heart pinned beneath the blanket, the way it had looked in the porch light when Delia held it out to him. He did not have words for that yet. He thought he might, eventually. Farrow called again in early November. The state attorney general's office had picked up the Groveland matter. Ackerley was a fictitious name attached to a man whose actual name was currently the subject of a sealed proceeding. But the practical effect was that 2 associated bank accounts had been frozen pending recovery action, and the family in Delia's county that had paid the fraudulent demand had been formally notified of their status as protected claimants. It was not full justice. It was the beginning of justice, proceeding at the speed that institutions move, which is not fast. It was proceeding. Farrow said, "Mrs. Marsh should know that her willingness to come in with documentation when she did was what made it possible to connect this instance to the prior filings. Without her records, we had fragments. With them, we had a pattern." Colt relayed this to Delia at supper. She was quiet for a while, eating, looking at the table. Then she said, "Harold always said a person's records are their voice after they are gone." Colt thought about Harold Marsh in his workshop with his outlined pegboard and his labeled files and his pencils sharpened to an exact length, building a record of what actually happened, year after year, decade after decade, without knowing that one November a stranger and a dog would come in from the rain and use it to speak for him. "He was right," Colt said. Delia looked at him across the table. There was something in her expression that was not sentiment exactly, or not only sentiment, but something more specific, the look of a woman who has spent a year carrying something alone and has recently been able to put some of it down. "I think Harold would have liked you," she said. Colt did not answer right away. He looked at Boone, who was in his place by the wood stove with his chin on his paws and his eyes at their slow, watchful half-rest. "I think I would have liked him," he said. That winter was not mild. December came with ice storms and power outages, and Colt spent the first week of the month getting the farmhouse ready in the way that old farmhouses need to be prepared, weather stripping and storm windows, and a careful inspection of the heating system and the water lines in the crawl space. And when the ice storms came, the house held. The pipes did not freeze. The wood stove worked. The power went out twice and came back. On the second night of the first ice storm, when the power was out and they were sitting by the stove with a lamp between them, and Boone stretched out on the rug, Delia brought out a box that she had been keeping on the top shelf of the bedroom closet. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside were Harold Marsh's service medals. The Purple Heart was among them. There were also campaign ribbons and a unit citation, and a photograph of a much younger Harold in uniform, standing in a group of men in a place that was flat and hot and very far from this kitchen. Harold at 20, with a face that was still forming into the face of the man he would become. There was something written on the back of the photograph in a handwriting that was not Harold's, 4 words in faded ink. "He came home whole." Delia touched the edge of the photograph. She did not say anything. Colt looked at Harold at 20, in that hot, flat place with the men around him. He thought about the distance between that photograph and this kitchen. 59 years of mornings and fence lines and ledger entries, and a woman named Delia. The whole long, specific weight of a life built with care and intention in a place that had been worth building it. He thought about 14 months of driving. He thought about what it felt like to stop. Boone raised his head from the rug and looked at Colt for a moment, then at Delia, then put his chin back down. In the spring, when the mud season was at its worst, and the south field was still soft from the snowmelt, a man drove up the farm road in a dark sedan and parked in the yard. He was in his mid-40s, smooth-faced, wearing a clean jacket that was out of place against the mud, and he had a card that identified him as a representative of something called Regional Land Partners. He had come to make an offer on the property. Colt was in the yard when the car arrived. Boone was beside him. The man got out and looked at Colt and then at Boone, and held out his hand in the practiced way of someone whose work was convincing people to agree to things. Boone did not growl. He did not move forward. He sat still and watched the man with his ears at precisely the angle they went to when he was processing something. Not alarm, not welcome, but a careful and unrushed attention that made the man's hand drop back to his side before Colt took it. "Is Mrs. Marsh available?" the man said. "She is," Colt said. "I will let her know you are here." He left Boone in the yard watching the man and went inside and told Delia what was happening. She listened, and then she said, "I am not interested in selling." Colt relayed this. The man said he understood, but that he would very much appreciate the opportunity to present the terms. Colt said that Mrs. Marsh had indicated she was not interested. The man said that the offer was quite generous, and that many families in situations like Mrs. Marsh's had found it to be a meaningful opportunity. Colt looked at him for a moment. He thought about a particular phrase. Situations like Mrs. Marsh's. "She is not in a situation," Colt said. "She lives on her farm. Her taxes are current. Her records are in order." He paused. "Her account has been flagged by the county following a fraud investigation, and that flag is visible to anyone who runs the property." The man's expression shifted just slightly. "I suggest you know that before you come back," Colt said. The man left. Boone watched the car until it was out of sight down the farm road, and then he turned and looked at Colt. Colt called Farrow that afternoon. He described the visit, the name on the card, and the entity name. Farrow said he would note it and pass it to the state office. He said that these kinds of follow-up contacts were not uncommon after a fraud filing, and that they were sometimes connected and sometimes coincidental, and that the flag on the property file was real and functioned as a deterrent. He said, "Is Mrs. Marsh all right?" Colt said yes. "Are you?" Farrow said, with the dry precision of a man who asks questions for a living. Colt thought about that. He was standing in Harold's workshop with the spring light coming through the small window, and Boone lying near the door. The tools were on their hooks. The files were in their cabinet. The new ledger that Colt had started in November at Delia's request was on the workbench, current through the morning. "Yes," he said. He meant it. By June, the south fence held. The kitchen window no longer let cold air through. The porch step was solid. There was a new section of gutter on the north face of the house, and the mailbox at the end of the drive stood straight. The farm looked like a farm that was being tended, which is the only way a farm looks right. June Hartwell came by on a Saturday with 2 other neighboring families, and they worked through the afternoon on the barn door that had been hanging wrong since the previous winter, and afterward they sat on the porch in the early June evening and drank lemonade, and the conversation went the way conversations go in that country, slowly and without hurry, covering the weather and the markets and the people who had moved away and the people who had not. Colt sat at the edge of the porch with his coffee and Boone beside him, and listened to this without contributing much, which was fine. He was learning that in this particular community, presence was its own form of participation. You did not have to say much. You showed up and you stayed, and that was sufficient evidence of what you were. Delia sat in Harold's old chair at the center of the porch. talking to June about a grandniece in college and a recipe for apple butter that June had been trying to get right for 3 seasons. She was easy in the conversation, easy in the chair, easy in the evening. She looked like a woman sitting on the porch of her own farm on a good June night, which was exactly what she was. Colt looked at Boone. Boone was watching the fields, the way he always watched the fields, with that steady and unhurried attention. The porch light came on as the sun went down, the same one that had been on the night of the rain, and it lit the yard in the same warm circle. And Colt looked at it for a moment. He was still not sure exactly what he had been looking for when he drove. He thought now that maybe that was the wrong question. Maybe the question was not what you were looking for, but what you recognized when you stopped. He had recognized this. He picked up his coffee cup and held it and watched the fireflies come out over the south field, over the fence line he had built, back right, and Boone made a small sound that was not quite a sigh, not quite satisfaction, but was something between the two, the sound of a dog that is exactly where it is supposed to be. And so is this what faith looks like sometimes, in the plain language of ordinary things. Not a vision or a certainty, but a porch light left on in the rain. A blanket held out to a stranger. A ledger kept for 30 years against the day it would be needed. A dog who sat down in a particular kitchen and simply did not leave. What you carry does not always feel like a gift until someone else needs it. What you have survived does not always feel like preparation until the moment it is. And the road that seemed to have no destination was, in fact, taking you somewhere, even when you could not see it. You may be on that road right now. You may have been driving a long time without knowing where you are headed. This story says only what the porch light said to Colt Drennan on that rainy October night. Someone has left this on for you. Someone is standing in the rain, holding out the last dry thing they have. You are not required to deserve it in order to receive it. May God bless you and watch over your travels, and may you find, in the place you stop, something worth staying for. Thank you for being here.